Welcome to the Lords and Heroes section of my Greenskin guide. In this video we'll cover the Lords and Heroes, the Greenskin factions, including campaign and battle, as well as abilities and unique effects. Disclaimer, this guide is based on my personal experiences and opinions and is by no means the definitive way to play the Greenskins in Mortal Empires. If you have a different strategy or want to add something to mine, please leave a comment down below. Now that's out of the way, let's get into the video. The Greenskins have the choice of 4 lords across 3 factions. Depending on what lord you choose, will have some minor and more serious effects on how they play in campaign as well as battle. I'd say overall the Greenskin lords and heroes are quite strong but a little limited. They only have access to 2 laws of magic, but both are really quite strong, so it makes up for the lack of variety. They also have lots of great choices for participating in melee, but for one-on-one duels they aren't really the best, but get the job done well enough for the most part. The melee heroes are also quite meh, but make up for it once they get their mounts. In fact, most characters that can get mounts should, as they're actually really good for the most part. Now, let's get into the lords. First up, we of course have Grimgar Ironhide, and he leads the Greenskin faction.
Get some.
Choosing him grants the faction +1 fightiness in foreign territory, plus 10% campaign move range to all characters, and minus 15% upkeep for Black Orcs and Biggun units. His army gets plus 12 leadership and plus 10 armor for Black Orcs, as well as plus 30% income from post-battle loot. And his starting army gets Orc Boar Boys, a Doomdive catapult, and some Black Orcs. On the battlefield, he is armoured, deals armor-piercing damage, and is a melee expert with a sprinkling of missile resist to make up for his lack of shield. He has no spells or mounts, but does have the abilities Foe Seeker, Stand Your Ground, and Warezag. He's best used in battle in the thick of your front lines, going against the most elite infantry you can with his Black Orcs. He can do pretty great in duels as long as they aren't overly strong or mounted, but if they are, then throw some support his way and he'll be fine. Leveling him is pretty standard. Root Marcher and the Red Tree come first as always, but then it's worth going into the Blue Tree to increase raiding income, seeing as you'll be spending a lot of your time doing this over the course of the campaign. While you're there, you may as well increase sacking income to unlock Lightning Strike, since the Orcs don't do well if completely overwhelmed as much as other factions like the Dwarves. The Never Second Best tree is worth filling as it gets some great bonuses, followed by Hatred, Tunnel Boss, and Dodgy Geezer for a few more buffs to him and his army. Finally, the Yellow Tree to make him even more of a terror in battle if you have nowhere else to toss points. He has access to 4 missions. The Battle of Broken Leg Gully is first up, and it's another slightly uphill battle versus a light dwarf force, and it's pretty easy to overwhelm them as long as you shut down any ranged units they bring. They do bring a couple of flying units, which can be a little difficult to take out, so make sure to bring a few ranged units to focus them down before they cause too much trouble. This battle only gets you progress towards his armor, which is unlocked in the next battle. Second is the Battle of High Pass, and it's another literal uphill battle, versus a moderate chaos force with 2 waves of light support reinforcements. You should be okay with a mid-game army, as long as you manage your units well and protect your flanks from attack. The blood-forged armor you receive makes Grimgar even tougher and scarier in battle, as well as giving him some buffs in campaign. The battle for Scarce Nick is versus a mild Empire force, which is pretty easy to take out from the advantageous hilltop location. They do get reinforced by some dwarfs, but again, it's nothing to worry about as long as you have something to take out their flying units. This should be pretty easy to do with a mid-game army with some artillery to use the hilltop position to the best of its potential. Scarce Nick is a great reward, as it gives plenty of buffs to combat, along with an ability and improvements to economy and corruption resistance. Finally, we have the Battle at Thundering Falls, and it's a pretty easy mission where you surround a dwarf force in a tunnel so you can sandwich and break them without too much bother. As usual, they do have some airborne reinforcements, but there will be no bother as long as they get focused down by ranged units. Next up is Ashog the Slaughterer, who is the second choice for leading the Greenskins.
The crowd's whispering.
Picking him gets the faction plus 25% to research rate, minus 25% construction cost, and minus 1 construction time to all settlement chain buildings, and plus 25% income from sacking. In his army, he has plus 8 leadership to his aura effect, as well as plus 75 to its size, and his starting army gets Orc Bigguns, Orc Boar Boy Bigguns, and some trolls. In battle, he is armoured and deals armor-piercing damage, as well as being a spellcaster with another sprinkling of missile resist once again. He's the only wizard with access to Law of Death in the Orcs and has one choice of mount, Skullmuncher. In battle, he is great for getting across the field quickly to assist where needed with his great AP damage or magical capability depending on what you need. This combined with his large leadership aura makes him and his army very hard to break if you use them right. Leveling him follows the same Root Marcher and Red Tree as usual, then I went for the Imbued with Darkness tree, followed by Get On With It and Tunnel Boss to get some lovely improvements for him and his units. The same blue tree skills I mentioned with Grimgar are worth getting too as soon as you can. His spells are of course worth getting when you can, as well as Dodgy Geezer for that sweet missile resist. His mount is always worth getting once you can, and as usual, the yellow tree is always there for any leftover points in the end. He also has 4 missions available to him. The Crown of Sorcery mission is first up, and it's against a small chaos force that gets reinforced by some vampires. It's probably a good idea to take plenty of anti-large and magical damage into this battle to ensure you can focus down these targets before they cause you too much grief. I did this with my late game army, but you could do this in the mid game quite easily as long as you pick your targets well. The crown he gets for this is very good as it grants him more magical ability as well as ambush and evasion in the campaign. The battle at Leipziger Ford is against a pretty large Empire force with lots of ranged and cav units, which can be quite difficult for the slow moving greenskins. Weirdly, I would say bringing counter cav of your own is probably a good idea here, as you won't be able to catch up to most of their army otherwise, and don't want them to spend all their ammo before you get a shot. I'd say a decent mid to late game army should do pretty well as long as it has plenty of anti-large and ranged units to take them out from afar. Completing this gets you progress towards Slagger Slashers, which is unlocked next. The battle at the Barrier Idols is against a large number of Savage Orcs with some Savage Orc reinforcements for variety. The reinforcements come in the form of cav and turn up pretty early so you can focus them down pretty quick to save yourself the hassle later. Other than that, I'd say bring a bunch of magical damage if you can to ensure you're getting through the physical resist of the savages, and bring plenty of ranged units since the enemy will struggle to defend themselves. The weapon unlocked grants magical attacks, stat improvements, as well as some campaign buffs. Finally, we have the battle for Azag's Ard armor. This one is versus large but weak Bretonnian force that surrounds you to begin with. Fortunately, the cav that surrounds you are only mounted yeomen, so are pretty easy to take out with basically anything from the mid-game onwards, and the dismounted force straight ahead will still be pretty easy to take out even if you get a little beaten up before. The armor unlocked makes Ashog much tougher in battle as well as in campaign, and will allow him to get back into the action from any wound faster should he ever fall. Werezag is next up, and he leads the Bloody Hands.
The Great Shaman.
Choosing him grants the faction minus 50% enemy hero success chance and plus 25 charge bonus for Savage Orc units, which is nothing to scoff at. His army is granted plus 15% physical resist, minus 50% upkeep and recruitment cost to Savage Orc units. His starting army gets a Giant, Savage Orcs, and Savage Orc Arrow Boys. In battle, he is a spellcaster and has the Frenzy ability, so will get a bunch of damage done while he is high leadership before retreating to support with spells. He has access to the big Warg spells and has one mount, Spleen Ripper. He also has the abilities Power of the Warg, Warpaint of Werezag, Werezag's Revenge, Get Back Here, Warg, and Effigy of the Git. Leveling him of course follows the same as before of Root Marcher, Red Tree, then Raiding followed by Lightning Strike. His spells are of course worth getting as well as Fury of the Prophet and of course his mount, and finally the Yellow Tree once you have nothing else to do. He has access to 3 missions, each of which can grant him unique items. First up is the Squiggly Beast, which is versus a pretty easy Goblin and Squig force with some Suicide Bomber Squigs as backup. These are easily dispatched by sending off cheaper units to take the force so that nothing reaches your more elite units. Just make sure your army is varied and better than goblins, and you should be just fine in the early to mid game. The arcane item gained gets some nice bonuses for all shamans in the faction, as well as granting a combat ability and corruption reduction. The Bonewood Staff is a head-on battle versus some Empire units in an open field. It's a pretty sizable army, but you only need to take out lords so you can cheese it if you're so inclined, with some flanks with character or some snipes of artillery, since the lords tend to hide at the back. If you really wanted to battle the whole army, then I'd say a pretty hefty mid to late game army would be needed, as they do bring a lot and they're not too weak either. If you manage to beat them, then you'll be rewarded with the Bonewood Staff, which is a weapon that grants improved combat capability and ability, as well as increases to post-battle loot. Finally, we have the Baleful Mask, which is again versus a mostly goblin army. This time they're on top of a hill, so it's a little harder but still quite easy to take them out with some well used flanks with a mid-game army. They get cav and artillery reinforcements, so it's definitely worth keeping some units back to take them out as soon as possible to avoid any unnecessary damage. The arcane item unlocked grants combat stat improvements, a bound spell, and some campaign improvements. Our final legendary lord is Scarce Nick of the Crooked Moon faction.
Supreme ruler of 8 peaks!
Choosing him grants the faction minus 50% hero action cost, plus 100% to hero XP from actions, minus 40% upkeep for goblins, along with only being able to recruit orcs in Karak 8 peaks from the unique building chain. His army has access to lightning strike from the start, as well as plus 14 charge bonus for night goblin squig hoppers. His starting army gets an Arachnarok spider, night goblin fanatics, and night goblin squig hoppers. In battle, he deals armor-piercing anti-large damage and has charge defense versus large. He also deals poison damage and has magical and missile resist. He has no access to spells or mounts, but he does have the abilities Wag, Spite of the Bad Moon, and Tricksy Traps. In battle, you want to keep him available to assist with any larger or more difficult targets that the enemy brings. If there's nothing else, then he'll do just as well against any lords, especially if they're mounted. Leveling him, of course, follows what I've been saying this whole time. Root Marcher, Red Tree, then a little blue Dabbity Dabba Die. The Nasty Skulker and Dripping Tips are always good choices for him, as well as Tunnel Boss to keep him and his army in tip-top. Finally, Yellow Tree is always there for any you have at the end, or if you just want him to be a one-man army. He only has access to 2 missions, and they are both for the same weapon. The first is an ambush versus a dwarf force of mostly miners with a few more elite melee and ranged units sprinkled in there. You can surround them quite easily and overwhelm them early into the battle if you deploy well enough. This mission of course only gets you progress towards his weapon. This should be quite easy to complete with some elite goblin units, but you can always wait until you get orcs if you want to make it really easy. The second battle is again surrounding a dwarf force, but this time you can attack from 4 directions at once if you wanted to. This army is fairly elite though, so you need to be a bit more careful to time everything well so you don't just have units going in one by one and retreating. It can also be worth bringing a spellcaster to this battle so that you can force the enemy into bunches where you can do some serious damage. Since it's a pretty tough battle, I'd say wait until you can get some more elite units before taking it on to give yourself the best chance. The weapon gained grants magical attacks, stat bonuses, an ability, and some campaign improvements. The first of the non-legendary lords is the Orc War Boss. He's armoured and shielded and has some missile resist, so can be extremely hard to take down once he's leveled a bit. He has no spells but does have the choice of 2 mounts, the Warboar and the Wyvern. He also has the abilities Wag and Foe Seeker. In battle, he wants to be in the front lines, keeping your troops topped up on leadership and making sure the enemy runs low on HP. With his flying mount, he can be across the battlefield in an instant, so don't be afraid to have him going all over the place. Leveling him is pretty simple, as it follows the standard build we've been over. Root Marcher, Red Tree and Blue Tree, Dodge Geezer for the missile resist, and of course Immortality as soon as possible so you don't lose all your hard work. Finally, Yellow Tree can be used to buff him even more in combat once you're happy with your other skills. The Night Goblin War Boss is the other melee lord available, and he's a little smaller but can still be pretty effective. He's not armoured but is shielded and has missile resistance, so he's very resilient to most forms of ranged attacks. He's a melee expert and has poison attacks, so he's very effective at assisting your melee troops as long as he doesn't get separated and surrounded. He has no spells but does have the option of a Great Cave Squig mount, as well as the abilities Get Back Here, Wag, and Spite of the Bad Moon. In battle, he's best used in the midst of your front lines to get his poison damage on the enemy and make it easier for the rest of your army to take them out. He isn't the best duelist, so make sure to give him support if he goes against any lords or heroes. Once again, we're following the same leveling system as before, so I feel no need to repeat it again, since you should know what's up by now. Our final lord is the Goblin Great Shaman, and he's our only non-legendary magical lord. He's obviously a spellcaster and has missile resist, but he's really more suited to the backlines than being anywhere near the action unless it's a total last resort. He has access to the little Wag spells and can have a giant wolf as a mount. He also has the abilities Evasion, Sneaky Stealing, Arcane Conduit, and Wag. In battle, he is best kept in the backlines so he can use his spells to support the army without being in danger of taking a bunch of damage. Only send him in if something flanks around to get your ranged units, and even then keep an eye on him as he still isn't the strongest. Leveling him is essentially the same, but you just pick up his spells after the red and blue trees, as this will help the entire army as well as himself. Other than that, follow the same as the other lords I've mentioned. The first of the heroes, as well as the only melee based one, is the Goblin Big Boss. He works as a multiclass as he can be used in armies as support, or on the campaign map as an assassin, depending on what you need. In battle, they are shielded duelists, so want to be taking on other characters one-on-one rather than being in the middle of an infantry brawl, so are very useful for supporting your less melee-oriented lords in their duels. They don't have any spells, but have two choices of mount, a giant wolf or a giant spider, and they have the ability Slippery. In campaign, they can cleanse corruption, damage enemy walls, assassinate enemy heroes and block their armies, and when embedded in an army, they scavenge to get more post-battle loot. Worth noting that, as with all factions, every hero increases your chances of finding Skaven undercities. Leveling can go one of two ways. If you're using them in battle, then you want to focus on the yellow tree while picking up Dodgy Geezer and the Nasty Skulker. Immortality is of course always a priority, and Scavenge is never bad for picking up some extra moolah when you're battling with the Lord. If you're going for the Assassin build, then you want to focus more on the blue tree, particularly Specialist and Assassinate, and of course get Immortality as soon as you can. Night Goblin Shaman are the smaller of the two spellcaster heroes, but they're not small in value for money whatsoever. In battle, they're obviously spellcasters, but they also come with Vanguard deployment, and if you saw the previous video, you know how I feel about poison attacks. That being said, they are still worth keeping close to the backlines and only using them in melee when you are sure you can keep them safe. They have no mounting options, but do have access to the Little Wag spells, as well as the abilities Sneaky Stealing and Madcap Mushrooms. In campaign, they spread Public Order, Steal Tech, wound enemy heroes, and hinder enemy army replenishment. When embedded in a lord's army, they scout and increase the chances of finding magical items post-battle. When leveling them, you want to focus on their use in battle to get all of their spells unlocked, as well as Dodgy Geezer and Madcap Mushrooms to make them more effective outside of spell use. Scouting is never bad to improve, as you can never have too many items for your characters. Of course, Immortality is always essential as soon as you can, so never forget about it. Our final hero is the Orc Shaman, and not only is he physically bigger, but his spells also make a bigger impact in my opinion. He's primarily a spellcaster, so you don't want him in the front lines, but since he's a big orc, he can take care of himself against some minor units, and even take some bigger ones on if he's supported, but generally in battle you want to keep him on the back lines to provide spell support as much as possible. They have access to the big Wag spells, as well as the Warball mount, and have the abilities Power of the Wag and Evasion. In campaign, they do the exact same thing as the Night Goblin Shamans, so spreading Public Order, stealing tech, wounding heroes, and hindering army replenishment, and when embedded in an army, they scout for magical items post-battle. Leveling them is also similarly straightforward. Spells take priority to make them worth taking into battle, as well as any mounts to give them more speed and utility. Scouting is always a good idea to get more items, and Dodgy Geezer is never a bad idea. And finally, Immortality is of course essential as soon as you can. Thanks for watching this section of my Greenskin race guide. If you want to check out the other parts, there's a link in the card and in the description for a playlist to the series. Don't forget to vote in the poll for the next race you want me to make a guide for, which is linked in the description and the comments. If you enjoyed this video at any point, then please do consider leaving it a like, as it really does help out a lot. And if you want to see more of this type of video, maybe click that subscribe button to stay up to date. After all, it is free. For now though, I was COLONELDAMNEDERS, and I'll see you next turn.